The frontier was a land that could strip a man of everything and leave him with nothing but the raw truth of who he was. It was a place where the sun carved scars into the earth and the cold nights hollowed out the soul. In such a land there were no easy choices, no gentle mercies, and no safety that was not won with blood or sacrifice. For most men who drifted westward, the desert was only a place of survival. But for Caleb Rowe, it became something more, a crucible where his entire life was burned down to ash. And from that ash rose a fate he never sought but could not escape. Caleb had once been known as a man of cattle and land. His spread had stretched across valleys. His herd had thundered like storms over the prairie, and his name had carried weight in saloons where men measured each other, not only by the guns on their hips, but by the strength of their word. But the fever took his wife, the drought devoured his cattle, and the creeping rot of despair turned his ranch into a graveyard. By the time another autumn fell across New Mexico, he was a solitary figure, a man hollowed out by grief, living on scraps of memory and what little the land chose to give. He had grown used to silence, to the sound of nothing but the creak of wood in the wind, and he believed he would die that way, unnoticed, unremembered, swallowed by the desert that had already claimed so much. But the desert was never a place of stillness. It carried secrets in the wind, whispers of those who moved unseen, shadows that crossed boundaries men had drawn but never truly owned. On a night when the stars shivered and the horizon seemed endless, Caleb's life was interrupted by those whispers. Out of the darkness came two figures staggering across the barren land. At first he thought them spirits, apparitions conjured by loneliness, but as they collapsed near the edge of his porch, he saw the truth. They were women, Apache, draped in torn blankets, their faces gaunt with hunger, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They had been driven far farther than most could endure, and the sand clung to them like death itself. He could have turned them away. Every settler knew the unwritten law: to harbor Apaches was to invite ruin. But when he looked upon their frailty, something deep within him stirred, a spark of the man he had once been, a man who had known love, who had known what it meant to protect life rather than surrender it to the indifference of the desert. So he lifted them into his home, placed them near the warmth of the fire, and gave them what little bread and water he had. The days that followed were filled with unease. The women recovered slowly, their strength returning with each sunrise. Their presence transformed the silence of the ranch into something almost unfamiliar. Where once the cabin had been a tomb of memory, now it carried the sound of movement, of breath, of life. Yet with that life came danger, for whispers moved faster than rivers, and the frontier thrived on suspicion. A trader passing the trail spoke of shadows at Caleb's window, and the town twisted the tale into something darker. Soon his name was spat in saloons as a traitor, a man who had abandoned his own kind for the company of those the settlers feared. And it was not only the settlers who had taken notice. From the ridges came the riders, silent and still, their horses standing like statues against the horizon. They did not strike, but their watchful eyes carried weight enough to shake even the strongest heart. Caleb knew these men were Apache warriors, protectors and hunters, sent to observe the fate of the two sisters who had found shelter beneath his roof. Each night their presence grew heavier, and each night Caleb lay awake, knowing that his fate was no longer his alone. On the fifth night, the silence broke. The thunder of hooves rolled across the valley, and the desert was lit by torches carried in strong hands. From the darkness emerged the full force of the Apache, and at their center rode a man whose presence seemed carved from the mountains themselves. Chief Deka, father of the two women Caleb had taken in. His arrival was not a raid, but a reckoning. The air carried the weight of judgment, of choices that could not be undone. Caleb stood in the firelight, waiting for the blow he believed inevitable. He had trespassed into their world, crossed a boundary with his mercy, and now he would pay the price. But the warriors did not raise their weapons. They surrounded the ranch with silence thicker than smoke, their eyes fixed on the man who had chosen kindness in a place where kindness was death. Caleb felt the air shift, as if the land itself were waiting to see how he would stand. In that moment, he understood that he had been bound to the Apache not by words, not by treaties or force, but by the simple act of saving life when no one else would. The desert had witnessed it, and the desert did not forget. Even as this truth settled upon him, another storm rose. Across the ridge came settlers, his neighbors, their faces twisted with fear and anger, their hands clutching rifles, their torches spitting fire into the wind. They shouted curses into the night, calling him a traitor, demanding the women be surrendered, threatening to burn his home until nothing remained but ashes. The two forces faced each other across the yard of a broken ranch, the settlers on one side, the Apache on the other, and between them stood Caleb Rowe, a man with nothing left but the choice he had already made. The standoff stretched into eternity. The torches hissed, the horses pawed the earth. The night trembled with the weight of unspoken violence, and yet no fire was lit, no shot fired, no blade drawn, for in the center of that storm stood a man who had nothing left to fear. And in his defiance, both sides saw something that unsettled them more than war. The settlers withdrew first, muttering hatred into the dark, and the warriors faded into the desert without a sound. But the chief remained. He stepped forward, and without words, placed a single white feather into Caleb's hand. It was not an ornament, not a token, but a bond. The meaning was clear. By mercy he had become kin, and kinship was a bond stronger than steel. From that night forward, Caleb's world was reshaped. He lived in the shadow of both suspicion and respect, a man unclaimed by either side yet tied to both. The settlers marked him as a traitor, whispering threats whenever his name was spoken. The Apache marked him as family, their watchful eyes ensuring no harm came to his land. And the sisters remained, their presence a reminder of the line he had crossed, a line that could never be uncrossed. Seasons turned, and the desert remembered. The rains that once refused him came back in their time. The earth that had hardened to stone softened enough to give him crops, and the silence that had once suffocated him was now broken by the rhythm of life. Yet Caleb knew the truth. He had not been saved by rain, nor by the turning of seasons, but by the act of mercy he had given, and the mercy that had been returned to him. His story spread across the frontier, not as a tale of cattle or gold, but as a lesson whispered in campfires and saloons. Some called him a fool, others a hero, but those who understood the land knew he was neither. He was a man who had faced the desert, faced two worlds that sought to claim him, and had chosen humanity over fear. And in that choice, he had become something larger than himself, a symbol that even in the harshest wilderness, mercy could build bridges where steel could only tear them down. This is how the frontier tested its people, not by the guns they carried, or the wealth they counted, but by the courage they showed when no one else would. Caleb Rowe had been broken, but in the act of sheltering two starving sisters he had been remade. The desert remembered, the Apache remembered, and though the settlers tried to forget him, his name endured. And so the question lingers, as it always will. If you had been the one to stand at that door, if you had been the one to face the hatred of your neighbors and the judgment of warriors, would you have made the same choice? Would you have risked everything for mercy, or would you have turned away, letting the desert take its toll? Only you can answer. If this tale of the frontier stirred something within you, do not let it fade in silence. Share it, speak it, and keep it alive. For the West is not only a place of dust and stone, but a mirror of the choices we all carry.